So today I'm going to talk about something which we have been working quite some time now. I'm going to show a few of the case studies that we have worked on, and yes, so I titled my talk as "People in Flood Risk Management." How do we incorporate them, and how does what sort of role they play in achieving our targets in terms of not just mitigation but also adaptation. We are in an era of climate change where adaptation plays a significant role in building the resilience and also responding to what people's needs are on the ground. So, a very brief discussion about what I do and what's my research on. I lead the Sustainable Design Group, and if anybody of you are interested, you can scan the QR code to get to know more about my work. I've been working primarily on these four verticals of Sustainable Development Goals, which is definitely related to health and energy burdens and gender equality, but primarily on how sustainability of low income habitats can be solved through a design approach. So primarily you will see me collecting a large amount of data on ground, and today also I'm going to show you how these sort of data vary from. So these are all very experimental data, and I a lot of people find me going around installing sensors in different sorts of built environment. Apart from that, I also talk to people on ground and try to get a more clear understanding of their needs, their wants, their perceptions of risks, and how they kind of view their life within that sort of a community setting. And then I use that to inform the broader goals of climate change and occupant well-being, while also responding to health and energy burdens. So obviously we are facing two great challenges today. One is extreme climate change, which brings us to respond to climate resilience in very resource constrained setting. And today I'm going to talk about flooding, where I also work a lot on heat and how heat has become a major challenge, in especially in global south, especially in countries like India, where we have lived with heat for quite significant amount of time. So when we look at the problem of flood risk, we often, I think this equation all of us have seen and heard by now, that it is a combination of what is the total amount of exposure that we are getting, and also what is the combination of what is the inherent resilience. So what do you mean by inherent resilience? Inherent resilience is the capability of a particular community, of a particular individual, of a particular system that can rebound to its own form after a shock like a flood, or after a shock like a heat wave. How does a system come back, and what are the inherent capabilities that are inherent in the system? Can we build it up so that we can become much more resilient to these sort of extreme exposures, which I think Professor Vinod Sharma very aptly said that these are going to be more frequent, and these will become our new normal or new reality very soon. So if you look at a very simple matrix of trying to understand what is the relationship between exposure and inherent resilience. So if you look at sorry if you look at this corner, I trying to use the pointer laser. If you look at this corner where you have very little inherent resilience, so this is lowest resilience to the highest resilience, and this is the lowest exposure to the highest exposure. If you are in this quadrant, you are facing extreme high exposure to some sort of like extreme flooding, whereas the inherent resilience is often not built. And we say that is a point where the society or where the system collapses because the inherent resilience is not built. However, if you look at this one where you have moderately lower exposure but and also moderately lower inheritance, it doesn't matter because it's quite stabilized. They are prepared, they have that level of Goldilocks inherent resilient, that they can fight with the exposure level that is there. However, if you look at this sort of system where the inherent resilience is also very high and exposure is also very high, that's a system where the it's like a war between the community or the individual against these climate change effects, where if the inherent resilience is completely higher, the system will get fatigued but it will not collapse. So we can say the first step of our being in order to fight climate change, in order to fight the risks of flooding, we have to build into this inherent resilience, and that can be a mitigation measure, which and Dr. Sharma spoke about. It also means we have to build in the adaptation measures. Today I'm going to give examples of what mitigation measures and adaptation measures look like, and is there a correlation between them, and can we use it to our advantage. So when we look at risks from flooding, there are two different types of risk. One is physical, which responds to social risk, economic risk, the environmental risk that comes with flooding. And I'm using the map of London to show what are the extreme flood risk areas in London. And I don't know if many of you know that in London also faces quite a high amount of flood risk events, and there are ways that are being used to mitigate it while also trying to adapt to it. And the second kind of risk is the perceptive risk. I was born in a community which I have seen every year during the month of monsoon, it gets flooded. The risk that I perceive living in that community might not be equal to the risk that a system perceives sitting quite far away and trying to mitigate the risks that are more visible. So generally, when we talk about flood risks, typically in a disaster management situation, we try to use the physical risk more, and the perceptive risk is often not captured in multiple data sets. But what happens is the perceptive risk tells us whether we are at with whether we will fight or flight. So if a person perceives the a minimal amount of flood risk as a physical flood risk as not very risky, they would probably continue their lives there. Whereas if they perceive it as a very high risky proposition, then they would probably take some sort of mitigation action immediately. And this is the mental representation of the perceptiveness of risk. And today I'm going to show how we can combine these two together to build up a very resilient system that can not only help us mitigate the flood risk management, also help us in adapting to flood risk. So I'm going to show case studies from different parts of the world, two cities extremely close to my heart, and also where I have worked extensively, Ahmedabad and Kolkata. And then I'm going to talk about one of the cities in Africa, which is Ethiopia, where we recently did a flood risk and intervention, and London, which we often see is at a high risk of flooding. So how are these the lessons that were learned across these cities can help us build up a more coherent system to respond to risk. And if you remember, I'll talk about more about physical risk and mitigation options for the cities of Ahmedabad and Kolkata, where I'm going to talk about more perceptive risk about Ethiopia and London. So when we started looking at what is flood risk, today we have very high mechanized systems to respond to understand which are the portions in a city which will be at high risk of flooding. And we use multiple sorts of data sets, mainly spatial data sets like digital elevation model, the flood accumulation zones, and then combine it with the land cover and the greenery cover, because that's where the runoff coefficient becomes extremely high, so or extremely low based on how the cities are planned. So we did the same thing for the whole of Kolkata. This is the Kolkata metropolitan area, and we monitored what was the elevation like. So higher the elevation, there is a lower risk of flood water being accumulated. Higher the surface runoff coefficient, there will be higher risk of lower risk of flooding. So but if higher the flood accumulation, that means flow accumulation, that means those are the areas or the pockets where the water will be logged for or larger time of the period, even beyond extreme precipitation event that has caused the flooding. And we also want to create these sinks where the water gets percolated, and we don't have extreme runoff within the city, which causes another sort of flooding. So, and then we can combine all of these very intelligently through a fuzzy system, so that we can very clearly predict which are the areas which can get flooded. Unfortunately, when you look at Kolkata, the major city of Kolkata is highly prone to flooding, whereas some of the other parts are not very much. So this is something which is very well known in the academic community, in the policy community, of how to predict which areas can become flood risk. We can go a bit beyond, which governments, disaster risk management units in different governments always do this. They go back, do a post evaluation of a flood to see where the water logging has stayed for how much duration. And today we have much more sophisticated system to even predict which areas will become much more flood prone, and a policy can be decided. And that's quite a good efficient system that we have available in India now, and thanks to very dedicated work on this. Second amount of flood risk that will flow into what perceptive risk is. We did the same thing for Ethiopia. This is in Addis Ababa, which is their capital city, and we wanted to know if there is an extreme flood risk in these cities, and which are the zones which have flood risk. Also, a lot of validation work was done to see if the prediction model was correct. And nearly nowadays, with sophisticated tools, this sort of prediction becomes much more clearer. However, if we look at what type of flooding or what type of area gets more flooded, so what we did was we picked up all those areas which have reported flooding and has been they're continuously being flooded for multiple years, and we wanted to see what was the main reason or the primary reason for flooding. So we mapped the whole of Addis Ababa to see which are the areas which get flooded due to encroachment, or housing in the riverbed, or built up areas extremely covered, taking up the flood basins. Whereas the other one risk comes from dysfunctional utility lines, like the drainage doesn't work, there isn't enough sufficient amount of channels to take out the flood water. So because of the dysfunctional utility lines, it's difficult to take the water away when on an event of flooding. Other sort of is the form faults, which generally is also linked to encroachment when a certain form of the land is modified due to urban development activities. These sort of land becomes extremely prone to flood water accumulation, and hence flooding becomes a much more prolonged problem rather than an event associated with extreme precipitation event. So we generated these sort of maps to see which are the areas which become much more flood prone due to different sorts of reasons. But we wanted to understand, what does it mean to the people who live in these flood prone areas. So what we did was we first developed the very physical flood vulnerability map from the flood risk map, and then went to people to ask about their responses to different sorts of perception of risk from flooding. Our idea was, if people feel that they have very high risk to flooding, they are going to automatically reorganize their systems, their community systems, their individual processes in place in order to mitigate the risks that come from flooding, in order to mitigate and intervene and create an intervention so that their life is not affected due to this continuous flooding. So we did an extensive mind mapping exercise with different parts of different people living in these different flood risk areas, and we asked them some basic demographic questions. We also asked them, what does flood mean to them? How do they perceive the risk during the flood and post a flood event? When does this flood become a burden to them? Is it a rainy season or a dry season? Or what sort of adaptive mechanisms they take in order to protect themselves from this risk, that their perceived risk of during the floods as well as a post flood event. We also tried to ask them, if an intervention is being designed by the government, is there a willingness to participate, or by the communities to participate in the flood risk mitigation or adaptation options that are being designed by the government or the disaster management unit of the government, and will they be willing to participate in either in by giving their labor, or by giving their resources in terms of funding, or in terms of different sorts of other sorts of resources. And we also asked them what sort of other risks they perceive because of this flooding. So we did find that a lot of people feel that in an event of flooding, the post flooding event comes with a lot of health risks. And so we wanted to see, do they prepare for that sort of health risk that may come with it, or are they well equipped to combat the health risks that come with it. And then so we asked them a multiple range of questions, and these were more interviews, and I'll show you a few pictures in the next slide, where we actually went and asked these people in different areas of encroachment, land reform, landform faults, and utility dysfunctional utility areas, which you can see in the map on the right hand side. And we went to these places, we talked to them what we want, and we asked them very simple questions, that in an event of flooding, what do you do? Do you stay in your home? When you have to go out, do you actually go along with the water flooded, the logged waterlogged areas, or do you find out an alternate route to do it? And are you okay with flooding? So there was one layer which was physical flooding, which told us the risk of physical flooding. But there was another geospatial layer that we created from these sort of perceptive risk. So areas which often showed extreme high flooding from physical attributes often may not correlate very succinctly with the perceptive risk of flooding. So we this is one representation of the maps, where we ask the household, how many times does the area get flooded? Is it one time, two times in a span of a year, or how many days does the temporal damage stays? So a post flooding, how many days the water stays there as a waterlogged areas, and what are the risks they see from that comes with flooding. So they said about material damage, health and material damage combined together, and some were others. But what we did was we also plotted these sort of values on the map to see if landform faults were more closely associated with extreme risk from health due to flooding, or flood temporal damage was higher because it was associated as a land encroachment or a utility fault. We developed an array of maps to see if the health impact was equally distributed, or was there an inequality of health just because the flooding incidents happens, and which is also a combination of their perception of risk. And we did find some areas which were primarily encroachment, they had a chronic high significant reporting of health risks being perceived quite higher. So they knew that once an event of flood comes during this sort of a monsoon season, Ethiopia faces a very strong three season in a year, and they have a very prolonged monsoon season, and they are already prepared with going to the medical clinic to collect malarial medicines. They know that they are going to face with diarrhea, they're going to face with typhoid, and obviously general cough and fever would also be. And more often than none, they know they will be post that sort of an health risk, they will be subjected to that health risk for quite a prolonged time, which is around it can range between 15 days to even 6 months, that sort of risk. So given that we can develop, so one of the learning that we gave, and we gave it to the policymakers there, was that we showed them this, made this sort of data which was completely invisible in policy space, to show that there are people who perceive certain areas as extremely flood risk, and there are areas where physical flood risk might be moderately higher. However, there are areas people have already adopted to mitigate towards flood risk. And we expanded this work with more amount of data for a community in East London, which gets flooded quite often, nearly every year. And with just 8 hours of rainfall, it can create a huge amount of flood water being logged. And we wanted people to see how that, so much so that 1 in 6 houses gets flooded every year. So we this is one of the work by my student, where they went to these communities and asked people to tweet with the hashtag flood me twice. And what they would do is they would take a picture of the flood, water logging due to flooding or post flooding or during flooding, during a heavy precipitation event. They would take a picture, they will upload the picture from their own perception, which they feel is a risky situation, and they would also use the tag flood me twice. And so we already had the quantitative flood risk map for that area, but we also built up a flood risk map which told us about people. So if you can see here in the quantitative map, these areas were perceived as extremely high risk of flooding, whereas when we combined it together, the bottom area, which was not coming as a high risk of flooding due to physical monitoring or physical mapping, it came out to be an extremely high risk from a people's perspective, from a perception of how people perceive the risk as flood. So that means if today we can prioritize our resources in areas which seem to be a combined physical and perceptive risk. This brings me to talking about solutions. So what we this is one of our paper which we have recently, which is under review now. We have been working with our colleagues from IIT Gandhinagar, and where we wanted to see in a living city, most of the flood risk management or technologies that we generally run as a prediction model, we often do not take the living biodiversity that is there. We often do not take the live living city as an example, or incorporate that into our model. We often take it as a static value. So we said that can we now take this as a more dynamic value to see if there are certain green infrastructure scenarios which can be adopted in different places as a flood mitigation and adaptive options. So we said that what is the percentage of risk reduction if we use a permeable pavement to a vegetative swale or a green roof or a bioretention. And we had different levels of flooding. One was 0 to 0.1 meters, which is just 100 centimeters, and then from there on, and if it's a flood water logging, or the flood depth is more than a feet, or is it more than a meter, which means there will be a significant amount of ground floor areas which will be underwater. So we wanted to see these four different scenarios to see which reduces the efficiency, or increases the efficiency of flood risk mitigation, or increase in terms of what is the total amount of reduction when we use a green roof as a situation, versus when we use a vegetative swale or a pavement. And we did find that while green roof has a lower potential to reduce the flood risk mitigation, but all the others, like the permeable pavement, vegetative swale, or bioretention cells, can has a higher probability of reducing the flood risk by nearly 50 to 60%. And this kind of tells us why we how we can develop solutions on a living city without actually trying to say that we need a large green park, or we need more greenery within the community. There are bioretention cells which can be easily designed along the pavements, along areas which are public spaces, and that can be redesigned to help in flood mitigation. And that brings me to a conclusion slide, where we talk about how do we mitigate flood risk. And the first step is to recognize, calculate the burden, taking into the people and the context within, grounding the burden with the interlinked sustainable development goals, that is the livelihood of the people, their health and well-being, would be extremely useful, because one, through just mitigation of flood, other sorts of burden which comes with interlinking of SDGs, they can also be mitigated and solved. Reflecting is the second step, where we should reflect on a people-centered approach, managing risk through giving intangible information that has been quite invisible in this policy space for quite some time. This actually makes it much more empowering, because if you go back to the community and show them that this is the type of perceptive risk that you are facing is probably more dangerous, so you should take more intervention. And lastly, also informing policy through evidence becomes much more effective, because then it's much more confident that if a policy has been implemented, that would reap in the correct results. Finally, how do you assure that these sort of technologies can actually mitigate the flood risk that we will be facing in the near future, or we will be facing very soon. So first of all, transferring the agency and generation of new data that I have shown, these sort of new data are very valuable in the policy space. However, is yet to gain much popularity in the policy space. Secondly, design resilience in cityscapes as a climate action. So when we embed resilience within the city design perspective, then it becomes a climate action as an automatic step, and we do not have to set up a separate cell or a separate entity to combat climate change. And last but not the least, because I do believe in this, we all should pray if nothing else works. Thank you so much.